You guys really keep me on my crafty toes. Lately, I've been trying new tools, inks, and techniques, and you left me some interesting questions and ideas for taking them further. Today, I'm performing 3 card making experiments. Can one ink pad really double the number of colors you have? Can you use a gel press instead of a sticky mat? Can you move the lid of your positioner rather than the paper when you want to do repeat stamping? Let's find out. When I want to use a lot of colors on one card, I often opt for repeating simple shapes, like these teardrops in the Pitter Pattern die set from Catherine Pooler. These actually match a stamp set, but I just like the variety of sizes in the dies, so I bought them on their own. I really want my drops to be all the same size, but I also want to do as few passes through my die cutting machine as possible. So I found 3 of the dies that are about the same size, and I taped them together so I could do all 3 at once. When you tape the dies together, you don't want to cover the whole space of any one of them, or it won't be easy to get the cardstock back out. So I find these thin tapes like this yellow tape or some washi tape are good. I did my math ahead of time, and I know I want 20 drops altogether in 10 colors. So I'm grouping them in twos on my sticky mat. I find it easy to blend small pieces when they're held down like this. I used to use my newsprint pad and some temporary adhesive, but this mat is really good for this. I'm working my way through the 8 colors in the Life of the Party color family from Catherine Pooler, and I had to add 2 more to get to 10. So I added Fiesta Blue between Aquatini and Something Borrowed, and then Serenade between Something Borrowed and Flirty Fuchsia. And no, doing 2 of each is not the way I'm talking about doubling your ink colors. But first, I think I need to clean up here so I don't get a lot of ink smearing when I do the next step. And this is where I remembered experiment 2, which was a viewer suggestion. The idea of using a gel plate instead of the sticky mat. So I lined all my shapes up on the 8x10 gel plate. So here's the double your colors idea. I took Pebble, which is one of the new gray inks from Catherine Pooler, and I'm going to blend it on half of each of my teardrops. To make masking quick and easy, since I'm using the same color for all of them, I grabbed a piece of acetate that I use for Copic coloring. I put tape on the edges so it's easier to find on my desk, and so I know that's what I use this one for, and it's not packaging from a stamp set. I placed the acetate down over half of the first drop, and I started blending the gray ink over the left half. Right away, I am not enjoying how much give there is in the gel plate. I don't think the drop is actually moving, but it certainly feels like it is. And I gave it a fair shot and did another one, but no, I am not feeling confident. So I went back to my sticky mat in the Altenew Stampwheel, where I had a much easier time once I figured out how to put down the acetate so it only stuck down near the drop I was blending. I'll be giving the gel plate another chance in a minute though. But notice how the gray ink is just adding a deeper shade to each of my colors. That's double your colors right there. This is a great way to be able to add some dimension or shadow to a blended die cut if you don't have a darker shade in the same color. And if you were using colored cardstock instead of blending your cardstock, you would have double the number of shades of colored cardstock. So that's experiment 1. Is it a success? Actually, there's a surprise ending to this story, and I'll have to come back to it because of a few other things I learned along the way. Next, let's try that gel plate again, but this time with a stencil rather than just blending onto small die cuts. This is one of Catherine's monthly stencils for her planner line, and I want to center 12 of the dots on my A2 cardstock. This will give me lots of stencil material to stick to the gel plate around the edges, similar to the sticky mat. I can see that the stencil's not flat right up against the cardstock, so I'm kind of pulling on the stencil to see if I can tighten it up a bit. Now I want to mask off the edges so I only have 12 circles exposed, so I'm adding some post-it tape. Now this tape is not over the edges of the white cardstock, so it's not helping the stencil stick to the gel plate at all, although it probably is helping the stencil stick better to the cardstock. Now I'm just using some sponge daubers to fill in my circles with the same 10 inks as before, and I'll repeat 2 at the end. Sponge daubers are great for small areas like this, especially when you're using a lot of colors. They're inexpensive and it's easy to have enough so that there's one for each color and no ink contamination. I know I usually say that I prefer brushes for stencils, and I do, but I think with these smooth edges, any damage to the foam daubers will be minimal. I'm trying hard to stay in the lines, but I can see I'm getting a little overblend going on in a few areas. So next, I've got the acetate again, and the Pebble ink, and a brand spanking new dauber for it, and I'm able to blend it on half of each circle. I have to say that even when I turn the floppy gel plate around so I can blend on the side I prefer, both the stencil and the cardstock are not shifting at all. And for stenciling, I think this is a pretty good alternative to a sticky mat. When I remove the stencil and the mask, I can see that my edges are not 100% crisp, maybe 85%. And that's because I'm using daubers instead of brushes, and also because my ink pads are recently refilled and very juicy. Cardstock removal? So easy. No sticking, no warping. Okay, let's give it one more try, but this time with a 6x6" stencil and no tape, and only one color, so I'm using the full blending motion with a brush rather than a circular motion with a dauber. This is the Marching Leaves stencil. It has a similar feel to the colorful teardrops from earlier, but this time I'm going monochrome, all in gray. First, I did a layer of Pebble all over. I got my turntable out so I can turn my work and blend in the most comfortable position. Next, I want to put a darker gray, the new Hoodie color, on one half of each leaf. I masked the first line with Post-it tape on either side, and even after I cleaned the ink off the stencil, I could not get that tape to stick. So I held it in place with my hand and I tried blending in small areas, like I advised you to try in last week's video. Well, I lost patience with that on the second row, and I looked around and found that yellow tape, and it worked so much better. After that, I had no trouble filling in the lines with the darker gray, and in the end, I got this kind of two-tone look. Okay, so I would say experiment 2 is a success. Definitely try your gel plate as a sticky mat for stenciling. Experiment 3 was also a viewer suggestion. Remember this big Sizzix stamp positioning tool? I used it a little while ago like this, and I moved my paper along to stamp a repeating pattern. Well, this viewer wondered that since the door comes off, whether you could move the door and the stamp with it along the notches on the end instead of the paper. That sounds interesting. I'm starting with a very simple straw stamp from the Feelin Fizzy set released this week, and I placed it near the bottom of my cardstock before inking it up with Hoodie ink. Okay, so far so good. Now I took off the lid, moved it up a notch. So now part of the lid is hanging off the top edge of the tool, but it seems to be functioning the same, so I stamped my second image. Then I moved the door again, and I stamped the third image. The placement of my lines is perfectly precise, but one obvious limit to this is that you can't really do any other distance than the distance between the notches. Now one more move for the fourth. I'm really liking this idea, and I think it would be amazing for repeating word stamps. They would be precisely lined up both vertically and horizontally. Now I'm done here, but I wondered how far I could move the lid before it became too unstable to get precise placement. I went right to the end and it felt a little floppy, but at second to the end, it felt like I could carefully stamp and continue the precision of my pattern. What a great idea! Experiment 3 is definitely a success. Now let's go back to my teardrops. You can see that as the inks dried, the gray seemed to disappear on a few of the colors, especially those darker ones. No worries, I just grabbed that darker Hoodie ink and I redid the ones I felt needed a little more oomph. And that's even better. The more gray inks you have, the more shades of your colors you can create. And let's go back to the circles now. Those uncrisp edges were bugging me, plus some of that overblending. So I cleaned them up with a circle die, and that gives me more flexibility for how I can use them. I didn't go back with the darker gray on these ones, and it's really interesting how that light gray actually turned a couple of the dark colors lighter. Look at the fuchsia and the something borrowed. It's really fun to know that we can get different looks just by combining our goodies in different ways. I finished all 3 cards with a simple hug sentiment using this die with a shadow. In a previous video, I shared how I like to best deal with these ones where the letters are all separate, and that is to cut one shadow with the letters cut out and then a solid shadow. This will help make sure I get proper placement of the letters as well as adding a bit of dimension. I colored the outline of this one gray and then inlaid the white letters. I always burnish from the back when I've got them all in, just to make sure everything's really stuck together. And you could run them through your die cutting machine with no dies, just the plates, to make sure they're really smooth and stuck together. So here's the teardrops. Isn't it amazing how some gray ink can change the colors and give the look of so much dimension? And I think that Tutti Frutti could have used a coat of the darker gray. I don't use Tutti Frutti very much, but look at it. Isn't it gorgeous? For the next card, I'm leaving the shadow and outline white, but I'm blending my rainbow onto the letters, just using the ink that's already in the daubers. So this card is kind of the reverse of the previous one. Gray dimensional teardrops in the background and a colorful sentiment, plus 3 of my extra circles from my next card. Now this time I'm just using the hugs word itself, and I'm cutting it right out of my panel. This is another great way to make sure you get perfect placement of your letters. I put some post-it tape behind the spaces for the letters, and then inlaid my gray letters right into the holes. And I can see here I've actually used Slate for the letters, and that's the darkest of the 3 new grays, and it's quite a cool gray, almost with a blue undertone. And again, I burnished it on the back, and then I trimmed it down to make a 4 1/4 inch square card, along with 8 of the dots I made with this stencil. Well, I have to say, experimenting is really fun, especially with a rainbow of inks and some fun new tools. I wonder what we'll think of next. Thanks to those of you who made these suggestions, and please let me know in the comments if there's something you want me to try. I'll gather them up and maybe do another experiment video in the future. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.